Testing. Yes. Is it okay?
Hej, hej. Hallå. Hello and welcome to Go to 10's live stream. And today, Paolo Nardi is going to talk about AI ecosystems. And yeah, if you have any questions, just write them in the chat. And hope you have a great time.
Thank you for the introduction and good morning, everyone. So today I'll be giving a talk about the AI ecosystem from a sustainability perspective. But before that, I want to introduce myself. So my name is Paolo Nardi. By profession, I call myself a sustainability innovation fusionist. And the reason why I do that is because of my diverse background. So I have a background in computer science and engineering, where I studied artificial intelligence. And then I got a master's in leadership for sustainability. This talk is a continuation from the last talk that I gave for AI for sustainability here at Go to 10, which you can actually find in the Go to 10 channel as well, if you would like to have a look at that one. Before I start this talk, I wanted to give a little preface of some of the things that we explored during that talk. So when it comes to AI for sustainability, these were some of the 5 themes that emerged, which is that the first one is finding harmony. And by this, we mean that today we really live in a crucial time. This is kind of the combination of what is called the AI age and the Anthropocene age, where as human beings, we are acknowledging the negative impacts that we've had created for the environment, but then it's also an upsurge of new technologies that can allow us to create things in a completely different way. And these two worlds really seem to be clashing, and there's an emergence of new technologies and new possibilities. So in order to embrace these changes, it is important that we find harmony between technology, society, our environment, politics, our economy, health, and even education. It's important that we address these different dimensions of our lives and bring them in such a way that can help us create a sustainable future. This, in a way, requires that we first and most all understand ourselves, because as sad as it may sound, AI will not actually create a sustainable world. We will. And thus, we need to understand our mindset and postures. We need to understand our assumptions about the ways in which we are doing things at the moment. We need to understand our belief systems and more or less how we design things. We need to build strong relationships and partnerships, because the problems that we are facing at the moment are too complex and too big for one individual or one nation to solve. And this actually requires that we work together towards a collective vision. When you look at China, for example, China has made such an economic advancement and such a technological advancement because they've been working towards a long-term vision for the past 20 years. Here in Europe and in the West, we don't necessarily have a future vision. We are kind of scattered, everyone doing one thing over here, one thing over there. And this is really creating a lot of challenges. So it's important that we start to address these issues that we're facing. Beyond that, it's important that we focus on what we have. Technology has actually come a very long way. And it is time for us to focus on how technology can be applied to create a sustainable and inclusive future, understand what type of systems, economies, and infrastructures can actually support this. One of them being, for example, the circular economy. There's also talks about the donut economy, etc. And this requires that we actually come together and drive positive action amongst several stakeholders, like civil society, the public sector, academia, the media companies, etc. We also explore the state of AI, so sustainable AI, and sustainable artificial intelligence solutions are actually at a very early stage. We're kind of like kids that have been developing this technology for a while and still don't fully understand the extent of it. It's kind of like we've discovered fire, and fire is a great tool, but it is important that we understand how fire can actually harm us as well. So we need to clarify policy and market reforms, we need to manage the second and third order consequences of the technology, and we need to consider the planetary boundaries and develop an ecological paradigm when we are developing these solutions. And lastly, a vision for the future is needed. So I love this meme from Alice, but it's when Alice asks the cat, what road do I take? Well, where are you going? I don't know. Then it doesn't matter. If you don't know where you're going, any road will get you there. And I think this is a really important question that we need to ask ourselves. Where are we going? And where do we actually want to go? Else, we're just going to be stumbling around and we'll get wherever life takes us, I guess. And because of this, I really wanted to understand more or less what is the ecosystem like today? What is driving the people developing the technologies, the organizations? Why are we working with this technology? Because in order to create change, we must first understand our current state. So the way that we did this was me and my thesis partner, we conducted an AI for Sustainability literature review, and we had interviews with AI practitioners from both large companies and SMEs. The literature review contained papers such as the McKinsey Global Institute notes from the AI Frontier, Applying AI for Social Good, #MoreThanCode, Tackling Climate Change with Machine Learning, and the role of artificial intelligence in achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. And this literature review allowed us to see that there are more or less 6 factors that take into consideration when we look at the ecosystem. There's the motivation and values from both individuals and organizations. There's what is perceived to be the impacts and effects that AI has in our life. There's the regulations that actually affect the development process of AI solutions. There's the perceived challenges and improvements that the industry needs. The design and development process, which is very important, because according to the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, 80% of the negative environmental impacts and social impacts that our technologies and solutions have can actually be addressed during the design phase, and as well as the collaborations during the development process. So who are we actually taking into consideration when we develop these algorithms, when we develop these solutions? Are we listening to the real needs, or are we just trying to solve something novel based on just our excitement to create something cool? So 9 AI practitioners were interviewed, and these were the questions that they were asked. So from an individual perspective, we asked them what led them to be involved in the field of AI, what they consider to be important when developing the solutions, what is the development process like, how do they measure the success of the projects, what is challenging about working in the industry, what do they believe can be improved, and what effects AI has in our world. And we also wanted to know who they collaborate with during the development process, or if they even do so. Who are the stakeholders that they consider, and what are the regulations that they take into consideration when they're working with these solutions. And what this gave us is this more or less AI ecosystem, which has 6 key factors, 48 concepts, and their relationships between them. So the personal motivation values, organizational motivational values, the collaborations, the design development, impacts and effects, challenges and improvements of the industry, and the regulations. And it's important to understand that this is a changing system as well. These interviews were conducted a year ago, so it would be interesting to see how the motivations or the development process has changed during that time. But today we will explore what we found out during our master thesis. So this is the ecosystem, you could say. So when it comes to the personal motivations and values, we observe that from an individual perspective, there was an attraction to the technology and the industry. There was a push towards change making and solving novel problems. There was a curiosity around the technology, and there was a drive to create business value. And The main reason for this is because AI is really a domain agnostic technology, meaning that it can be applied across so many different industries and so many different challenges, but it is still a core fundamental tool. So if you're someone that is highly curious or highly creative, then AI is really a way for you to express that creativity and explore different aspects of life and solve different problems. When it came to the organizational motivations and values, we saw that organizations are looking to implement AI solutions in their organizations to ensure the sustainable growth of the company, so more or less future-proofing. I think many organizations are realizing that this is the future and that they need to start working with it. They also talked about taking into account the governance aspects of AI. So now since 2016 and 2018 when the GDPR really came into being, there is more or less a need to ensure that AI is done in a way that is going to match the future regulations. They also talked about considering environmental impacts of the technology and providing a working environment that facilitates development. So organizations really seem to be using AI as a way to attract new people that want to work with to solve novel problems. During the design and development process questions, we observed that more or less AI solutions are developed in 3 different cycles. So first there's the discovery phase, where organizations talk to clients, they highlight the pain point, they research on different solutions and architectures and models that they need. They create a proposal. Then from there, they move into the development cycle, which is all about defining how the model should perform. So what are the key performance indicators? Understand the data. So really understand and collect data more than anything. The shape of the data, whether there's biases, etc. Draw some preliminary tests, design the models, do the MVP, add explainability to the model. This is really dependent whether the solutions are what you would consider to be high-risk solutions, where if something goes wrong during a decision, then you would need to explain why the AI made that decision. And lastly, they need to ensure that the model can be implemented into an existing infrastructure that can live in the cloud and kind of self-sustain itself. So this then moves to the production cycle, where you create the model containers and data pipelines for iterative learning and scalability if needed. You deploy the model, you maintain it, and you make an improvement. So this is more or less how AI solutions are being created today. And what we observed is that during these phases, there seems to be a lack of critical analysis of the negative impacts that the technology may actually have, which is something really concerning, I would say. Then we asked about the collaboration during the development processes of AI solutions. And here we saw that there was different perspectives. So the ways in which small, medium enterprise and big organizations collaborate is very different, but they also have some commonalities. So from an SME perspective, we see that they mainly collaborate with clients who are not familiar with artificial intelligence, or they have third-party collaborations when domain expertise is needed. Big companies, on the other hand, seem to be collaborating with each other to push more towards industry standards, because they are the ones that really hold the data resources and infrastructure at the moment, and who will be most affected by regulations. And they're also trying to work towards understanding the long-term vision of the technology. But here, as you will see in one of the challenges, is that although they're working to understand the long-term vision, they still want to have this aspect of legacy, which means that there is some conflicting values between each organization. So even trying to understand this long-term vision while they're so close to the technology can be challenging. And from a shared perspective, there's a common consensus that there is not enough collaboration with outsiders. So what this really says is that AI practitioners seem to really kind of just be working within a silo, and they're not necessarily inviting policymakers, social workers, etc. Then beyond that, they are collaborating on a project basis. So this is yet again where domain expertise is needed. And they're mainly focusing on the economical and organizational stakeholders, and not so much on the societal or environmental stakeholders. From the challenges and improvements, yet again, three perspectives arose. From the SME perspective, we saw that the challenges was infrastructure and accessibility problems. So data is really nowadays a commodity, and accessing good quality data that can actually draw good models has been a challenge for SMEs, alongside working with clients that actually have the digital maturity for them to develop solutions for. So one of the improvements was that there needs to be a better infrastructure for AI solutions to be useful. Another challenge was on the working process. So there was unrealistic delivery times, and this mainly came from this kind of notion of AI washing, that people don't seem to fully understand yet what AI solutions entail, the difficulty working with them, and more or less what it requires to develop them. So, and the last challenge was in regards to the distribution of resources, and this is mention of the industry monopoly. So right now we really have some tech giants that seem to be more or less building an empire based on this technology, like Amazon with their AWS cloud, Google, Facebook. They're the ones that are really driving this notion forward, but at the same time, it's not allowing people to access the technology so easily and create solutions that can actually help their regional content. And some improvements, like we said, better infrastructure, transparent auditing for impact assessment, so more or less of a triple bottom line impacts, and reduce the resource inequality. From big companies, what we observed is that the challenges was that sustainable solutions actually required more effort and resources, and it's also difficult to manage the short and long-term goals. There's the development bottlenecks, so going from research to implementation of AI is actually quite difficult. There was the address aspect of the societal conflict, like we said, AI washing and legacy of companies. So there seems to be quite a lot of organizations and even startups nowadays that are using the term AI to drive investment where the technology actually is not AI on its nature. And this is actually creating problems and confusion around the technology and the terminology. And another challenge was there was a lack of inclusive development. Some improvements, they talked about creating compatible and accessible infrastructures. So this is really, they mentioned this aspect of big organizations of the horizontal development of the technology instead of the vertical. So you would take the vertical aspect as more or less the tech. The horizontal is the application, so where you can apply it, and making that accessible. So one way to do that would be, for example, sensors as a service. So this could actually lead to sharing economies and horizontal development. There needs to be an eco-friendly and smart data infrastructure, and more cross-sectoral collaborations. From a shared perspective, we see that there's a big confusion around what AI actually is, and thus we need a clear understanding of what AI is and what it isn't. There's a lack of talented practitioners with real-world experience. It is challenging to balance both the positive and negative effects of AI, since it's so new. And there's a lack of transparency, openness, and effort to collaborate. And this is really interesting because even recently, a week ago, this woman came out talking about the whistleblower of Facebook, of how Facebook is actually, there's research within Facebook that they know that at the moment, negative news feeds actually drive more engagement. And because these companies are really monetized by the amount of time that we spend in the platforms, the algorithms of Facebook actually show us more negative information in order to increase their bottom line. So this is really a negative impact that are emerging right now and that we're starting to see. Improvements, well, clear understanding of AI, and I think in general, digitalization and how digital technologies have an effect on us. There needs to be more transparent, open, and explainable models. That we need to clarify the ethical guidelines, regulations, and privacy concerns. And we need to collaborate more and decentralize the technology. Now we're going to explore what the practitioners mentioned to be the impact and effects of AI at the moment. So AI is really automating and optimizing working processes. It is being integrated across all domains. This in turn is driving this aspect that new skills are actually needed to drive AI. Beyond that, it was discussed that AI can actually help us reduce negative environmental impacts. In 2016, Google actually managed to decrease their energy consumption of their data centers by using AI technology. And all of this is also driving to a huge economic change because we see now not only countries but big organizations monetizing quite a lot due to this technology. I mean, Facebook is now a $1 trillion company. Amazon is growing, my God, stupidly big and huge. And these things are really creating monopolies of resources that we do need to take into consideration because we do live in an open system, but we also are humans. And we need to understand that money can actually corrupt. And unfortunately, when you have an organization that has that much power, and not only economic power, but knowledge about you, about your life, then they can really start to affect societies in ways in which we will not even become aware of until maybe 5 or 10 years. And I don't want to scare anyone, but it's important that we do take these things into consideration before it becomes too late. Which you would say, but there should be regulations to more or less take into consideration all those things so that they don't happen, right? Not so quite. So at the moment, actually, SMEs don't focus much on AI regulations because they're not really clear and they don't really affect them. So it's enough to be GDPR compliant. Big companies, though, are affected by software security, privacy, and environmental regulations. And they also mention indirect regulations such as the Agenda 2030 and ethical papers on AI. And most recently, there was the EU regulation proposal, which it's still a proposal. And I think this is important to understand that we still don't have concrete regulations at the moment. But the EU regulation aims to classify AI systems into 3 categories, which are unacceptable risk. And by this, they mean AI systems such as, for example, what you would call a society rating or a social rating, things like that. There's high-risk technologies. I'd say like driving autonomous cars would be one of them. And limited or minimal risk, which is just kind of like chatbots and things like that. So each of these categories has its sets of different regulations that I will not go into detail in this talk, but it's still important to know more or less different AI solutions are being classified as. So in terms of regulations, there are some actions that organizations and practitioners need to deal with working with AI. So it's been discussed that there needs to be a board involvement. So there needs to be business leaders' accountability. There needs to be a continuous monitoring of how the technologies are being used, how the data is being collected, towards what purpose. There needs to be organizations need to purchase regulatory-friendly software, especially if they're going to build AI solutions on top of another software. So they need to make sure that both of them are more or less in line with regulations. And there needs to be a deep communication amongst several stakeholders as this more or less goes on. So then what is actually more or less needed moving forward, right? So I'd say the key needs right now is that we need to incorporate a planetary and system paradigm when we are developing these solutions or when we're even talking about these issues. We're not longer at a point in time where we can actually take the privilege to develop things without taking into consideration long-term effects or things like that. There is global affluence, there is free access of information nowadays, and it's become clear that where we stand at the moment and how we're doing things, that if we do continue going this way, we will not have an Earth for the next 50 years. And if we actually want to drive a change, we need to really understand this. And we also need to challenge our thinking to understand that things are actually not as simple as they may be. We live in a complex system. We need to understand our relationships in order for us to start working with them. We need to address the legacy mindset. And this really comes down to what I would consider to be like the strong ego that we may have, that we want to own things and we want to say, this is my organization, I'm going to build a legacy around it. And I think this is a very human thing to do, and we should still embrace it for what it's given us, but at the moment we need to move towards a more collective mindset if we're actually to solve these issues. We need to be also aware of the algorithmic biases. AI, just like any solution, can actually, just like any technology, can boost biases in our society because they are trained on data from the past, and we need to understand that we have been extremely biased up until now. So we need to be aware of these things in order to make the solutions more accessible and actually for them to lead to an inclusive and diverse world. Which leads to the next one, which we need to address the unequal access and benefits of the solutions. Right now, there's really, I would say, the US, Canada, some countries in Europe, and China that are developing these technologies, which are going to drastically change our society. And we need to involve others in the conversation, and we need to more or less train them and upskill them for them to be a part of this, to be a dialogue of the future world we want to create. We need to clarify the terminology around AI and understanding around it. We need concrete regulations. We need to decentralize the power of big tech companies. And most anything, like, understand that AI is really a core technology. It's a tool. If I have a hammer and I don't know how to use a hammer, I'm going to destroy everything. I'm just going to go and I'm going to smash everything and I'll be like, bam, bam, bam. But if I know the use of a hammer and I have the wisdom behind the hammer, then I'm going to be able to build something around it. And that's really where we should, I believe, we should put our focus on. Developing the technology, making it better, of course, that's a no-brainer, but we're already doing that. We also need to focus on the other aspect, which is gaining the wisdom behind it. And that is not something that, from our research, we see organizations or even practitioners taking into consideration so much at the moment. Which leads to the next one. We actually need cross-sectoral collaborations. We need to have people from different disciplines to be involved in this. if we are to gain a holistic perspective on AI and our world, we actually need to have different people looking at it. Because if you were to take, for example, that right now we are, in a way, have created systems and infrastructures that we know are not sustainable, that we know are not going to lead to a better world. You could take this as more or less like a cancer in the middle of your chest. One way to get rid of the cancer, you could say, you could put this really high intensity beam that goes into it. The problem is that if you take one beam as one perspective, or one discipline, or one person, or one nation, if they put all their efforts to do that, that beam actually has so much intensity that even though it might remove the cancer, it would still affect the skin. But on the other hand, if you have other sets of beams with less intensity that are focusing towards that same issue, then collectively they will be able to diminish the cancer without damaging the skin. So it's actually very important that we understand these things, because we will always have a limited perspective. No matter who you are, there are things that you do not know. And it's important that we actually start to have a dialogue around these issues and challenge ourselves to expand our worldviews. And this, of course, will then lead to a and upskilling. So the skills of the future, the knowledge, the capacities of the human being will drastically change, because we are not longer just analog beings, we're also digital beings. And we need to understand how to use our emotions, how to use our mental capacity, how to create things. So, yeah, that's more or less what I've discovered during this amazing journey of exploring how AI and sustainability are related. And it's important for me to mention that I really do believe that this technology can help us create a better future. But I see a lot of a lot of human challenges that are actually stopping us from getting there. And if we don't address those challenges, we will miss on a huge opportunity to create a future that we're actually excited about. So I think for that, we also need to kind of use this aspect of social imagination. Use our imagination. Like, the future is something that we create. Whether we do it consciously or not, it's up to us. But wouldn't it be exciting if we can get together and paint something better? I mean, else, what's the alternative? We keep doing things the way that we've been doing them. We run out of resources in 20 years. Okay, that's one way. But or we can go to Mars, right? Who will actually go to Mars? I don't think the majority of people will go to Mars. And why go to Mars when we have something so beautiful here? So I think it's important that we kind of take responsibility for these things and start to tackle these issues from a critical but also collective perspective. And go back to the heart. Like, really, we're all human beings, and I think the majority of us wants a better world, and we just need a way to come together and learn how to collaborate and admit that, hey, you know, as human beings, we're kind of not very good at collaborating. We like our ideas, we don't like to be challenged, and this lack of emotional capacity to have these tough discussions is leading us to a bad place, and we need to change. So, yep, I don't know if anyone has questions in the chat, but I can leave it open for that. Yeah, but if not, then that's really it. Do you have any questions? Nope. Yeah. Well, then we can leave it at that. Thank you so much for everyone that joined us online, and thank you so much for being here.